So, does anyone care to touch on this further?
My name is Jerry. I left MAGA and I'm here to spill all the tea. Welcome back to my channel. I'm working on this playlist, Let's Talk Jeffrey Epstein, or Let's Talk Epstein. And let's go ahead and move right on into this episode. I'm again over here at Unlimited Hangout. Yeah, I've got some varied and sundry different resources that I lean into, as you've noticed probably, and you will notice as we continue. Anyway, the original Jeffrey Epstein, and the link will be in the description below. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't the only billionaire philanthropist who had houses in Palm Beach, New York, Paris, London, and an island paradise, as well as throwing elite sex parties for rich and famous. Meet George Huntington Hartford II, the original Jeffrey Epstein. The article was originally published March 6th, 2023, and is written by Johnny Vedmore. It says it's a 17-minute read, which means it's probably going to take me 45 minutes to get through it. But anyway, Black Hand, the original Jeffrey Epstein. There was once a wealthy billionaire philanthropist who owned houses in Palm Beach, New York, and France, as well as a Caribbean island paradise where he hosted young girls for elite sex parties, far away from prying eyes. Like the infamous pedo and people trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, this Harvard graduate sent his employees into the streets to recruit young girls for him to coerce and molest. One such employee, Stephen Ward, a man who played a central role in the downfall of the British government in the early 60s, reportedly recruited girls from the streets of London for this wealthy man, and even drew him a sketch of a young girl being pleasured by machines in particular ways. Also, like Epstein, this wealthy pedo had significant intelligence ties, which ensured he was protected from prosecution. The people I speak of was richer than Epstein and had more properties than Epstein, yet unlike Epstein, he was never caught, charged, or prosecuted for any of his crimes, eventually dying of old age in his late 90s. This is the story of George Huntington Hartford II, a friend of Hogdibben and Stephen Ward, and a billionaire who was closely related to the intelligence-linked propaganda creators who were behind the invention of James Bond. George Huntington Hartford II, the original Jeffrey Epstein. Sitting on a table at Esmeralda Goulin's Montrose Club one evening in the mid 1950s was a young actress who went by the name of Marjorie Steele. She wasn't just an actress; she was also a master forger who, on the night in question, was reportedly competing with the artist Pietro Annigoni to see who could best reproduce her husband's signature. Steele was her stage name, with her married name being Huntington Hartford. So it looks like here's the three signatures: genuine signature, forgery of his wife, and that's interesting. So let's see. Marjorie had married into a very wealthy family. Her husband was George Huntington Hartford II, who was born on 18 April 1911 in New York City and had inherited his vast wealth from his grandfather, George Huntington Hartford I. When Huntington Hartford was just 6 years old, he began receiving an annual income of $1.5 million. His grandfather had created the concept of chain grocery stores after taking over the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P, and had amassed a great fortune. Huntington Hartford, so the second's father, Edward, was not as interested as his brothers in the creation of excessive wealth and slowly distanced himself from the wider family, once declaring that at least one Hartford ought to be a gentleman. George's mother, Henrietta, was also unlike the rest of the family, and this led to a persisting rift. Edward's brothers had refused to help their sibling financially, and eventually Edward went so far as to break off contact with them. Edward would also do the same with his own children before his death in 1922. Josephine Bryce, George's sister, said before her death in 1992, quote, "I don't think Hunt ever saw him at all," end quote. If the absence of his father wasn't bad enough for George, his mother also negatively impacted his psychological development. Henrietta Huntington Hartford was a domineering mother, and George was her favorite child. He became the focus of most of her attention, and his sister later described her mother as smothering him in a cocoon of mother love. In a lengthy article published in Vanity Fair on the life of George Huntington Hartford, entitled Hostage to Fortune, on 12 June 2010, it was said that Henrietta would still lean across the dinner table when George was a teenager and cut his meat for him. That article, which contained quotes from a disheveled 93-year-old George Huntington Hartford, also notes that he scowled at the memory of his mother, telling the reporter she was domineering, very domineering. She sent Hartford away to school at St. Paul's in New Hampshire, where George was reportedly bullied constantly by other students for being from New Money. He stated, "I was very innocent, 12 years old, and I was sent to a very horrible place. My mother should never have done that or done it," end quote. While making the latter statement, Huntington Hartford is also noted as having raised his voice in distress at the memory. It was very clear that from the early life of George Huntington Hartford II that his development had been stunted in many ways by the absence of his father and the overbearing nature of his mother. It is also very clear from his sister that he had kept much of that hatred and anger from his family hidden, or for his family hidden inside. And that would be a really pernicious way to live, man. I mean, that would be just like bottling up all that hate, just holding all that acidic, just toxicity inside. George Huntington Hartford II and Marjorie Steele, pictured 3 days after their 1949 wedding. Fort Worth Star Telegram, Sunday, 18 December 1960. Why is it always back in Dallas, Fort Worth? Anyway, in 1931, Huntington Hartford eloped with his first wife, Mary Lee Epling, the daughter of a dentist from West Virginia, a decision which apparently caused his mother to throw herself onto the floor and weep. Melodramatic. The pair were regularly found mingling with other members of American high society, but the marriage came to an early end in 1939 after his wife left him for the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. This was mainly due to Huntington Hartford chasing skirt, but also because he had impregnated a 23-year-old chorus girl named Mary Barton. Unfortunately for Mary Lee Epling, Douglas Franklin Jr. himself was a notorious rascal, I like that word, and would become a future attendee of Horace Gibbons' elite sex parties. Wow. Huntington Hartford had reportedly floated the idea of his mother adopting Mary Lee Epling so that he might keep her as a sister after their divorce. Creepy. Man, it's been a long time since I read this. Huntington Hartford graduated from, let me try that again. Huntington Hartford graduated from Harvard University in 1934, where he studied English literature. Yeah, I dare you. Go ahead, try that. Huntington Hartford graduated from Harvard. Anyway, only a couple of years after graduation, he bought his sailing ship named the Joseph Conrad, a rare square rigger sailboat that he had purchased from famed writer and adventurer Alan Vier. I hope I got that pronunciation right. Huntington Hartford soon became an avid sailor, taking part in ocean races such as the one reported on 28 August 1937, an event where he and Walter S. Gobelman raced from Newport, Rhode Island to the Bahamas. After graduating from Harvard, Huntington Hartford went to work for his uncles at AMP's company headquarters. However, his uncles were apparently keen to make George's entry into the family business, difficult. They put him in the statistical department of the company where he oversaw the tracking of the sale of bread and pound cake. Quickly becoming disenchanted with the experience, George took a day off to attend a Harvard Yale football game. His alma mater lost, and George Huntington Hartford also lost his position within the family firm. By 1942, Huntington Hartford was investing in property in Santa Monica, purchasing a house built by an opera singer in Runyon Canyon during the war in 1942. In 1948, Hartford also launched a modeling agency in Los Angeles and New York so that he could be with girls. And it is here where his employees began picking up young girls off the street for him to sleep with. Lisa Rebecca Gubernick, who wrote a biography of George Huntington Hartford II entitled Squandered Fortune, stated, quote, Hartford believed that if he bought enough and built enough, he could convert his those bold-faced mentions in the society column to to lasting fame. End quote. Posited that the AMP heir hoped to build a cultural empire. Indeed, throughout the 1940s and 50s, Huntington Hartford attempted to make a name for himself in the art scene, but the incoherence of his vision meant all his grand projects eventually failed. By the time he was becoming known as a patron to the arts, which continued to be the case when or when Hartford had met his second wife, the young Marjorie Sue Steele, who was recorded in the New York Times as a former nightclub cigarette girl. I'm sorry, yeah, I didn't end that sentence right. Anyway, he had met Marjorie while selling cigarettes at Cairo's nightclub in Los Angeles, and and had enticed her into a relationship by purchasing her merchandise. His ruse worked, and by all accounts, she became the favorite of his four wives, or of the four wives, yeah, of his four wives he had during his lifetime. At the time that Huntington Hartford began wooing Marjorie Steele, she was already engaged to Charlie Chaplin's son, with the legend of the silent movies himself being the one to advise her to leave his own son and to marry a wealthy Huntington Hartford instead. Wow, that's crazy. Anyway, I wonder how Charlie would be thinking about what's going on now. Back to this. In the 1950s, Huntington Hartford began purchasing properties in New York City, Palm Beach, and New Jersey. He also purchased the famous Hollywood estate known as the Pines, a London townhouse, a property in France, as well as buying a house on Hog Island in the Bahamas. He later purchased Hog Island entirely in 1959 and renamed it Paradise Island, soon attempting to turn it into a haven for illicit elite sex parties involving underage girls. He even gave Paradise Island its own flag, which was shaped like a pea. a symbol that he also wanted to put on the moon as a symbol for world peace. Um, this island is still functioning, or we're going to get to that, I do believe, in this article. The decade of 1950s were seen as the most productive years of his life, bolstered by Marjorie's ambitions as an actress and a painter. He began investing in the movie industry, produced one of his wife's more successful movies in 1951, opened a theater in Hollywood, and founded what was described as an artist colony. During these busy years, he found time to write I'm sorry, to write an adaptation of Jane Eyre for Marjorie, which had a short run on Broadway and eventually flopped after Marjorie pulled out of the project because, quote, she just decided it would hurt her reputation as an actress, end quote. To that, Huntington Hartford had stated, quote, I think she was right, end quote. Hartford began investing in all manner of grand projects during this era, all of which were to be failures under his leadership. This was also to be the fate of his marriage to Marjorie, which was heading for divorce by the end of the 1950s. Huntington Hartford, Ivar Bryce, and James Bond. Oh, this should be fun. No, actually, I know it is. By 1960, Huntington Hartford's marriage to Marjorie was coming to an end, and he was celebrating by organizing elite sex parties, as well as becoming a regular at Hod Dibben's sorted London-based events. At the famous, sometimes satanic-themed sex parties held by Hod Dibben and Maria, Mariella Cates, aka Mariella Novotny, George Huntington Hartford mingled with the elites of London. Gangsters such as the Cray twins, as well as many of the main characters involved in the Pro Formo affair, an event which saw the downfall of the British government. One of the people who sometimes attended these gatherings was Stephen West, who was to become the main patsy in the Profumo scandal, resulting in his death by overdose while in custody during one of the most high profile court cases Britain had ever seen. Douglas Thomas mentions Huntington Hartford's relationship with Stephen Ward and Horace Dibbon in his book, Stephen Ward Scapegoat, stating, throughout the 1950s, employees would approach young women on the street on his Hartford's behalf. In London, Stephen Ward, the sketch pad in hand, did that for him. He also sketched a drawing of a girl being pleasured, girl being pleasured around the world by a machine for Huntington Hartford, who gave it to a friend of Kim Waterfield, the billionaire American liked Girls in the Flesh, as did the producer Harry Allen Towers, who was invited to a London party thrown by Huntington Hartford. There, with Stephen Ward and Hod Dibben, was Mariella Novotny. Commented by Marjorie Steele, Thomas also states, the first of his four wives was Marjorie Steele, an aspiring actress. When they married in 1949, she was a teenager. Huntington Hartford liked Prime. The later statement was partly false, as Marjorie Steele was actually the second of Huntington Hartford's wives. However, he was well known for liking Prime, with Thompson going on to say, it was George Huntington Hartford, one of the world's richest men, and a fan of Hod Dibben's sex parties, found 18-year-old Mariella a little on the old side. In fact, Stephen Ward's attempt to entice Huntington Hartford into Mariella Novotny's bedchamber opened up a very dangerous can of worms, which eventually contributed to Ward's untimely death, something we'll explore more later in this series. One of the most interesting associates of Huntington Hartford was his brother-in-law, a man named Ivar Bryce, born John Felix Charles Bryce in 1906. Ivar's father had made his fortune dealing in guano while his mother had worked as a painter with a side job writing detective novels. Now, if you're not familiar with what guano is, that's bat manure. And why would it be important? Nitrates. War was on somewhere along in those times. So it was a great source for nitrates for manufacturing that gunpowder stuff, that cordite. Anyway, during World War One, to escape potential Zeppelin attacks, an 11-year-old Bryce was sent to Cornwall. There, on a Cornish beach, Bryce met a young Ian Fleming, and the two boys formed an enduring friendship. Fleming and Bryce attended Eton College together and later went on to co-publish a magazine called The Wyvern, where Bryce's mother used her connections to persuade famous artists such as Welsh painter Augustus John to contribute drawings. The magazine was also used as a far-right propaganda tool, and at one point, they even published an article praising the British Fascist Party. During World War II, oh, slightly just knocked over my mouse. During World War II, Bryce began working for William Stevenson, who was the first, or I'm sorry, who was the head of the British Security Coordination, BSC, operating out of New York. The BSC was an offshoot of MI6, which was set up by Winston Churchill to investigate enemy activities, and it was funded by the Rockefellers. Anyway, to investigate enemy activities, prevent sabotage of any British interests in the Americas, and to positively influence American sentiment towards the British. They used many underhanded methods to achieve their goals, and Bryce was charged with stirring up trouble between the United States of America and their various Latin American neighbors, initially by using the threat of Nazi infiltration to force specific American policy actions. In Thomas Mall's book, published in 1998, entitled Desperate Deception, British Covert Operations in the United States, 1939 to 1944, it states, Bryce worked in Latin American Affairs section of the BSC, which was run by Dick Coit, known in the office as Coitus Interruptus. That's funny because there was little evidence of the German plot to take over Latin America. Ivar found it difficult to exile Americans about the threat, or excite, yeah, found it difficult to excite Americans about the threat. Now, I just want to point out something interesting here about this timeline with these British covert operations, uh, 39 to 44, because, hang on a second, because Operation Underworld ran from 1942 to 1945, and it was a joint operation between the Office of Navy Intelligence and MI6. Hoover tried to wiggle his way in. He was seen as a little too zealous, a little too passionate for the British. So they ended up forming ties with ONI. It was over the bombing of a military vessel in New York Harbor that was under control of the mafia, and that's where Lucky Luciano comes in. Anyway, Operation Underworld overlaps with a good portion of this covert operations desperate deception book. So moving along, to remedy American interest in the potential Nazi infiltration of Latin America, Bryce created fake propaganda, which successfully helped to sour relations between the U.S. and Cuba. I did a video recently. John Stockwell. He was talking about this sort of manufactured propaganda. But of course, it's going to be fake or manufactured, but this propaganda that was used in Vietnam and Angola during those time periods in the 60s and 70s to steer public opinion in the United States. So going back to the article, in his biography, You Only Live Once, Bryce writes about an early operation to undermine the Cuban American relationship via the creation of a map, which was intended to be given to U.S. Congress as evidence that Cuba was helping the Nazis set up secret bases in their country. Bryce writes, sketching out trail sketching out trial maps of the possible changes on my blotter. I came up with one showing the probable relocation of territories that would appeal to Berlin. It was very convincing. The more I studied it, the more sense it made. More were a genuine German map of this kind to be discovered and published among the American firsters, what a commotion would be caused. American firsters. Okay, so we're talking we're talking back in the 40s, right? Right? Does any of this sounding familiar? Or a genuine German map of this kind to be discovered and published among the America firsters. What a commotion would be caused. So moving along. In this instance, the ruse was carried out successfully and became a catalyst for Congress's decision to dismantle what remained of their neutrality legislation, which went on to pave the way for a more uh, acrimonious relationship between the U.S. and their Cuban neighbors. During World War II, Ivar Bryce built a property in Jamaica, and his friend Ian Fleming, who was then the personal assistant of the director of British Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey, had decided that he would also live in Jamaica and write full time after the war. In 1945, Bryce helped Fleming find some land and a house outside uh, Aracabesa, with Fleming calling his newly found retreat Goldeneye, the name of one of his projects during the war. In 1950, Ivar Bryce married into the Huntington Hartford family and wed Josephine Huntington Hartford. Like George Huntington Hartford II, his sister Josephine Bryce had had inherited wealth from their grandfather. Yet, unlike George, she invested it well, concentrating on owning racehorses and becoming very successful in her own right. During the late 1950s, Ivar Bryce, Ian Fleming, and George Huntington Hartford also began producing films together. In April 1953, Fleming had published a novel entitled Casino Royale, which introduced his readers to a British secret agent serving Queen and country, who went by the name of James Bond. The book was successful, and soon Fleming began working with Ernest Cuneo to develop scripts for James Bond's cinematic debut. Cuneo, I guess is might be how it's pronounced, had been an important, if not vital, figure in the operations of the aforementioned BSC during World War II. He also admitted to passing information to American decision making on, yeah, mm. He also admitted to passing information about American decision making on British spies during a time where the Brits were intent on manipulating U.S. actions. Caneo stated, given the time, the situation, and the mood, It's not surprising, however, that BSC also went beyond the legal and ethical and the proper throughout the neutral Americas and especially in the U.S. It ran espionage agents, tampered with the mails, tapped telephone, suggested propaganda to the country, disrupted public gatherings, covertly subsidized newspapers, radios, and organizations, perpetrating forgeries, even palming off on the President of the United States, or even palming one off on the President of the United States, violating the Aliens Registration Act, uh, shanghaied sailors numerous times, and possibly murdered one or more persons of this country. Xanadu or bust. In April 1959, the film journal Cinema, Cinemagra- Cin, Kinematographic Kinematographic Weekly reported that producer Kevin McClory and financier Ivar Bryce, who head Xanadu Productions, are planning to build their own studio in the Bahamas. The the Bahamian, or Bahamani, how do you say that word? Government, the Bahama government was keen to see a film production company establish itself on one of their 3,000 islands. They were quick to offer the company tax cuts and other incentives under their Encouragement and Industry Act to entice Bryce and McClory to invest in the Bahamas. Kevin O'Donovan McClory had originally met Ivar and Josephine Bryce during a visit to their villa on Providence Island in the Bahamas. The villa itself is called Xanadu, to discuss collaborating on the film called The Boy and the Bridge. The Sunday Mirror reported on the match in September '59, stating that that the upshot was that Bryce went into partnership with Kevin Bryce's money and Kevin's know-how to make a film. Also in April 1959, Ian Fleming wrote a letter to McClory potential James Bond, concerning potential James Bond movie ideas, with that letter also being used in a 1963 court decision between Bryce and McClory after their business relationship eventually broke down. However, in August 1959, McClory and Bryce were still on agreeable terms and were reportedly about to start work on their own studio in the Bahamas, basing the production company and much of the development of the James Bond franchise in the Bahamas made sense for many reasons. The Huntington Hartford children had both purchased homes in the Bahamas, with George's Paradise Island being located very close to Ivar and Josephine Bryce's Xanadu Villa. But the main reason for Bond being based in the Bahamas was McClory himself, who claimed that he was responsible in, or for a large part of Ian Fleming's novel, Thunderball, being set in the Bahamas. McClory claimed that in the previously mentioned 1963 court case that Bryce and Fleming had tried to oust him as the producer of the proposed Bond film. Eventually, like the relationship between McClory and Bryce, the plans to build a studio in the Bahamas began to unravel. George Huntington Hartford had promised that his redevelopment of Hog Island to Paradise Island was to see the creation of a dignified vacation resort. In 1960, the New York Times reported that the island at Nassau in the Bahamas was to be the place for artists and writers, socialites and diplomats, teachers and scientists, sportsmen and students, and an atmosphere of cultural enjoyment. But Huntington Hartford was going to have to work hard to make his Paradise Island vision a reality. especially if he was going to attract the right crowd and if he was going to attract the right crowd. In November 1962, the project was described as the most elaborate resort primping for its first full winter of operation is the $23 million Paradise Island project of Huntington Hartford, just 15 minutes across Nassau Harbor by special boat. This holiday complex encompasses a French restaurant, a 52-room hotel, lavish tropical gardens, a swimming pool, and superb tennis courts. When the island's Ocean Club finally opened in 1962, elites jetted in from all over the globe, with over 1,000 people reported to have attended Paradise Island's official launch party. But by March 1963, Huntington Hartford's island resort was experiencing problems with crime after a gunman held up a group of tourists who were visiting Nassau and on their way to the Paradise Island Resort. Four men were reported to have stopped the taxi after ramming it with their vehicle and were said to have stolen the belongings of the taxi's occupants. At the time, the tourists were traveling back from a night at a Bahama nightclub, NASA's only gambling casino at the time. The taxi driver was also told the police that the bandits all sounded like Americans, even though the robbers managed to get away with only around $1,000 cash. Their haul contained some extremely pricey jewelry, including a diamond ring worth $250,000, and their heist saw them net items totaling in excess of $750,000, which was equivalent to over $7 million in today's money. Huntington Hartford, Sir Richard Estate. So I'm not going to play this video. If you want, you can go check it out. It's embedded in the article, and the link to the article will be down below. But yeah, that's Huntington Hartford's house on this island. It still exists. And by the way, fun fact: one of the other things that exists on this island is that Atlantis Resort. So, continuing. As it was with every other endeavor which Huntington Hartford undertook, he soon became disinterested in his Paradise Island project. By October 1964, his resort was up for sale. The press reported statements by Huntington Hartford's broker, a man named Johnny Machio, admitting that the island had never been profitable, blaming the 52-room hotel for limiting the venture's profitability, saying, "You can't pay for men like Pancho Gonzalez, the island tennis pro, and Gary Player, the golf pro, with 52 paying guests." The 700-acre property, which Huntington Hartford had originally purchased from a Swedish industrialist named Dr. Alex Wintergren in 1959, was finally reported to have sold 7 years later. Huntington Hartford didn't get the 32 million which he originally wanted, with the resort eventually selling for around 14 million instead. There seems to be a pattern to this. I'm thinking about the Zorro Ranch stuff. Anyway, a man about London town. Many wealthy elites, such as George Huntington Hartford, had significant and close ties to various members of different national intelligence agencies during this period. Many of these agencies were still evolving in terms of the scope, scale, and style of their operations throughout the 1950s and 1960s. American and British intelligence agencies were not fighting their Soviet foe publicly, and instead of taking certain actions themselves, were often found utilizing front organizations such as the BSC to coerce their allies into making certain decisions. Central to the ideological war between East and West during this era was the battleground of London. The Cold War was rarely fought in the open, and in major capital cities such as London, spies representing all sides were conducting deals in the shadows. This put the nightclubs of London on the front lines of the information war, which had the power to sour international relationships or potentially spark wide-reaching international incidents. This era of spy games was made much more dangerous by the dawnings of the nuclear age, with everyone involved believing in the risk of nuclear warfare, mutually assured destruction, and the potential extinction of life on Earth. To gain access to sexual encounters with young women and girls, men like Huntington Hartford attended these secretive elite sex parties based in London and exposed themselves in more ways than one. While this vast while his vast inherited wealth and his many significant and powerful connections afforded Huntington Hartford some protection, the only benefit that these not so private events had for the wealthy billionaire was that they offered him the opportunity to fulfill his carnal desires. However, for the intelligence agents and their associates, these sordid events became a prime place to gather compromising information on powerful people, which could then be used against them later. Yeah, it wouldn't, or it shouldn't surprise anyone that organizers of the elite sex parties, such as Horace Diven and George Huntington Hartford II, were useful allies for compromise operations run by the various intelligence agencies, whether they knew it or not. Like Horace Diven, Huntington Hartford himself gave his companions access to a real underworld of hidden sexual subversion, which many people still think is a fantasy, or still think is fantasy. However, this particular era of sexual compromise operations was coming to an end. The people involved were naive to believe that they could control such a complex blackmail operation indefinitely. Soon, a group of much more serious and sinister predators were slowly surrounding the people who thought they occupied the top of the intelligence food chain. There was a new wave of spies coming to prominence who were active among the melting pots of both London and Washington, D.C. People such as Tom Grabali were skulking around the American and English capitals and soon would become or begin to enact the scandal of the decade and bring about the downfall of the British government. Yet, it wasn't only the British government which these intelligence agents intended to coup. They were also looking over the Atlantic towards America and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Soon, this investigation will go deep into the actual Profumo affair and the intelligence linked to characters who made it happen, such as George Huntington Hartford, or as for George Huntington Hartford. He became a drug addict and lost nearly all of his fortune. He spent the last years of his life lamenting his uh, many negative childhood experiences, bedbound, and disgruntled. He eventually died in the Bahamas at the age of 97. So that's the story of the Epstein before Epstein, George Huntington Hartford II, OSS connected, and downright elite pervert. So, yeah, hurt people, but if hurt people do their work to recover, they're less likely to hurt people. Just saying. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. And hey, I called that about right, about 45 minutes. um, take care of yourselves so you can take care of each other. Try to get the rest that you need and keep track of those fluids. Till the next video.